It was one of those rare afternoons in Phoenix, Arizona, when the sun hung low, casting a golden glow across the city. The air was warm but not suffocating, and the sounds of the bustling city seemed distant, as if a veil of calm had descended on the quiet apartment complex. In one of the units at the Palms, an upscale residence just on the edge of downtown, Evan, a 33-year-old tech consultant, sank into the poolside lounge chair, ready to unwind after a week that had nearly drained him. Evan had been working around the clock to finalize a contract with a major client. And after days of running on coffee and adrenaline, he decided to treat himself to a few hours of solitude by the pool. With a book in hand and a chilled drink beside him, he felt the kind of peace that only came with long-awaited relaxation. As he flipped the pages of his novel, his mind began to wander. The weight of his daily responsibilities was momentarily lifted, and he could almost forget the mounting pressure of his job. The sun, reflecting off the water, seemed to make everything shimmer in a way that felt almost surreal. It was an idyllic scene until the sound of someone approaching shattered the tranquility. Evan glanced up from his book, expecting to see another resident or perhaps a visitor enjoying the pool. But what he saw instead was something more unsettling. A woman, in her mid-50s, with sharp, angular features and platinum blonde hair meticulously styled in a way that suggested she spent more time getting ready than most people spent on their entire morning routine, walked straight toward him. She wore large, dark sunglasses and a look of purpose that didn't leave much room for small talk. Evan had seen her around the complex before but had never interacted with her. He had no idea who she was. And at this moment, he wasn't particularly interested. The woman approached, her heels clicking against the pavement with an authoritative rhythm. She stopped at the edge of the pool, eyeing Evan with an expression that mixed suspicion and curiosity. Without any preamble, she spoke in a tone that was both direct and intrusive. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "Do you live here?" Evan was caught off guard. He glanced at her, trying to read the situation. His first instinct was to smile politely and make small talk. But something about her demeanor made him pause. "Yes," he replied slowly, sitting up straight and setting his book aside. "I do." The woman didn't appear convinced. Her eyes narrowed, and she looked him up and down with an almost scrutinizing gaze. "Really?" she pressed, her voice now tinged with doubt. "Because I don't recognize you. Are you sure you don't just have a guest here?" Evan felt the sting of her words but held his ground, not willing to let her push him around. "I live in apartment 402, he said calmly. "I've been here for almost 2 years. Her lips tightened, as if the answer hadn't satisfied her. "Well then, you should have your keycard," she snapped, a demand hidden behind her words. Evan was taken aback by her forceful tone. "I'm not obligated to show you anything," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If you have an issue, contact the management." The woman's face flushed with irritation. "I'll do that," she said, already pulling out her phone and dialing, her voice rising in volume as she spoke into the phone. "I'm at the pool and there's someone here who's definitely not supposed to be. He claims he lives here. But I don't believe it. I need security to come down right now." Evan sat back in his chair, feeling the tension in the air grow thicker with each passing second. He wasn't in the mood for drama, but it seemed as if this woman wasn't going to let him enjoy a moment of peace. His eyes scanned the pool area, and he noticed a few other residents had begun to glance in his direction. Some exchanged looks of curiosity, while others discreetly pulled out their phones to record the scene. The atmosphere shifted from calm to charged, the quiet hum of the complex now filled with whispers and half-concealed judgments. With a sigh, Ewan returned to his book, doing his best to ignore the rising storm around him. But as the woman continued her loud conversation into the phone, his sense of calm began to fade. He had dealt with difficult people before, but this was something different. The scrutiny was palpable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being judged, not for anything he had done, but simply because of how he looked. The woman's words carried across the pool, and it wasn't long before a young security guard appeared at the entrance. He looked to be in his mid-20s, his face registering a slight confusion as he assessed the situation. "Everything okay here?" the guard asked, his gaze flicking between Ewan and the woman. "She's accusing me of trespassing," Ewan explained, standing up to meet the guard's gaze. "I've been living here for 2 years. Apartment 402. I have nothing to hide." The woman, clearly not used to being challenged, raised her voice. "He won't even show me his keycard. He's lying about living here. You need to check him." Ewan reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed the guard his keycard, then opened it to show his driver's license, which displayed the same address as the complex. The guard glanced at the card and the ID, then nodded. "That checks out," he said, handing the documents back. "Sorry for the trouble, sir." But the woman wasn't done yet. "You're just going to take his word for it?" she spat, her face contorting in disbelief. "What if he's faking it?" The security guard glanced at her briefly before shaking his head, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Ma'am, there's nothing else to discuss. He's proven he lives here." As the tension began to ease, there was a moment of silence. The onlookers, who had been watching the spectacle unfold, exchanged glances, some appearing relieved that the situation was resolving, while others still seemed uneasy. But then, from the other side of the pool, a voice broke through the quiet. "Enough is enough." The words were spoken with such authority that everyone turned to see an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, standing up from her seat by the pool. She was wearing a simple floral sundress, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun. The woman's demeanor was commanding yet composed, and as she made her way toward the small crowd, it was clear that she had something important to say. The elderly woman's sudden interjection sent ripples through the small crowd gathered at the pool. All eyes shifted toward her as she made her way towards Ewan and the security guard. Her movements were deliberate and confident, and the sharpness of her gaze cut through the tension in the air like a knife. She had the kind of presence that demanded respect, and everyone instinctively took a step back as she approached. Ewan had no idea who she was, but her calm demeanor seemed to diffuse the situation in an instant. The woman stopped in front of Deborah, the woman who had instigated the confrontation, and fixed her with a steady look. It was the kind of look that made it clear she wasn't going to back down without speaking her mind. "Excuse me," the elderly woman said, her voice firm but measured. "I think it's about time someone said something." Deborah blinked in surprise, her posture stiffening as she turned to face the newcomer. "I'm sorry," she said, clearly flustered. "Do I know you?" The woman didn't flinch. "Oh, I think you do," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You've been causing trouble in this community for months now. We're all getting tired of it." The statement hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and for a moment, no one moved. Ewan stood silently, unsure of what was happening but grateful that someone was finally standing up for him. He watched the elderly woman with growing interest, realizing that she wasn't someone to be intimidated by Deborah's bravado. Deborah's face reddened, and she opened her mouth to respond. But the elderly woman wasn't finished. "Last week," she continued, her voice cutting through the air, "you accused a delivery driver of loitering just because he was sitting in his truck eating lunch. And just a few days ago, you called the police on some college kids moving into their apartment because they didn't look like they belonged. Deborah took an audible breath, clearly thrown off by the unexpected confrontation. She was speechless for a brief moment. But then she straightened her back, her defensive posture making it clear that she wasn't backing down. The elderly woman wasn't done. And now, here you are, harassing a man who's done nothing wrong just because you don't recognize him. You're embarrassing yourself, she said, her voice rising with indignation. There was a ripple of murmurs in the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. Ewan felt a sense of relief wash over him, as if the tide had finally turned in his favor. The weight of the scrutiny he had been under was slowly lifting. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he wasn't the one who had to fight this battle. Deborah's face twisted in a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You don't know what you are talking about," she muttered, her voice shaky. "I'm just trying to keep the community safe." The elderly woman didn't back down. Keeping the community safe doesn't mean accusing people based on nothing but your own assumptions. This is a place where people are supposed to feel at home. Not like they're under constant suspicion because they don't fit your narrow idea of what's acceptable. Her words hit like a hammer, and Ewan could see the realization beginning to dawn on the other residents. The few people who had been quietly watching from the sidelines now exchanged glances, some offering quiet nods in approval. Deborah, on the other hand, seemed to shrink with each passing second. "Do you even hear how ridiculous you sound right now?" the elderly woman asked, her tone softening just enough to deliver the final blow. "You are the one who doesn't belong here, not him." With those words, a few of the residents began to clap. It started slowly, but soon more people joined in, the applause growing louder with each passing second. Ewan looked around, amazed at how quickly the tide had shifted. The sense of powerlessness that had gripped him moments earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of solidarity that felt almost surreal. Deborah's face flushed with embarrassment, and she stood frozen, her arms crossed defensively. The applause only grew louder, and Ewan could see her trying to hold back tears of frustration. She turned on her heel, gathering her things in a hasty motion. Without a word, she marched out of the pool area, her pride shattered, leaving the rest of the residents to quietly celebrate the unexpected victory. The elderly woman, now calm and collected, turned back to Ewan, her expression softening. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's not right, and it's not fair." Ewan smiled faintly, grateful for the unexpected ally who had stepped in when he needed it most. "Thank you," he replied. "I didn't know how much longer I could stand that." The crowd began to disperse, the incident seemingly over. The once tense atmosphere had lightened, and the energy in the air was markedly different. But as Ewan began to gather his things and head back to his apartment, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find a notification from a social media app, the headline of which made his stomach drop. A video of the entire confrontation had already been uploaded. The caption read, "When will this stop? Another instance of prejudice at the Palms in Phoenix." Ewan stood there for a moment, staring at the screen in disbelief. The situation that had started as a simple misunderstanding had escalated into something much bigger, and he wasn't sure how he felt about it. The video showed everything: Deborah's accusations, his calm responses, the elderly woman's impassioned defense, and the applause that followed. As the video began to gain traction, Ewan realized that this moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a larger issue that affected everyone. The conversation about racial profiling and prejudice had just moved from the poolside to the global stage. And there was no turning back now. The next morning, Ewan woke up to a flood of notifications. His phone buzzed incessantly as messages, notifications, and tags from social media piled up, each one seemingly more urgent than the last. As he scrolled through his inbox, his heart raced. The video of the confrontation at the Palms had gone viral, sparking conversations on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The hashtag Justice for Ewan was trending, and the comments ranged from messages of support to debates about the broader issues of racial profiling and discrimination. Ewan hadn't anticipated any of this. What had started as a quiet, uncomfortable moment at the pool had quickly snowballed into something far bigger. His face, captured in that brief moment of calm, was now plastered across the internet, and people were calling him a hero, a symbol of grace under pressure. Strangers reached out, sharing their own experiences with discrimination and expressing gratitude for the way he handled the situation. The recognition felt surreal, but with the overwhelming support came the detractors. Some people accused him of overreacting, claiming he had turned a simple misunderstanding into a spectacle. There were others who questioned his composure, implying that he had let the woman off too easily. But none of the negativity could shake the sense of purpose Ewan now felt. He had known that standing up against prejudice was never easy, but he hadn't expected his actions to have such a far-reaching impact. At the Palms, the ripple effects of the viral video began to unfold. Residents who had once remained silent were now speaking out. Some were sharing their own experiences with Deborah's behavior, recounting past incidents where she had made unfounded accusations or created tension in the building. As the video made its way into the hands of the property management, they could no longer ignore the problem. The leasing office called an emergency meeting with Deborah, Ewan, and the property manager, Melanie, who had seen the video herself and knew the gravity of the situation. When Ewan arrived at the office, Deborah was already sitting at the table, her face pale and her body stiff. She didn't meet Ewan's eyes as he entered the room, but he could feel her discomfort radiating from her. Melanie, the property manager, was sitting at the head of the table, her expression serious. "Good morning," Melanie said, her tone businesslike. "Let's get straight to the point. I've seen the video, and we've had several complaints about your behavior. Deborah, this kind of conduct is unacceptable. It's not just a one-time incident, but a pattern of targeting people based on assumptions." Deborah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she muttered, clearly defensive. "I was just trying to make sure everything was safe." Melanie shook her head. "It's not your job to decide who belongs here. We have a security team for that. Your actions have caused unnecessary distress for Ewan, and for others who've been subjected to your unwarranted scrutiny." Ewan remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest. He had never intended for the situation to escalate this far. But now that it had, he knew he couldn't let Deborah's behavior go unchecked. The video had given him a platform, and he wasn't about to waste the opportunity to stand up for what was right. "I didn't do anything wrong," Deborah insisted, her voice rising. "He didn't even show me his keycard. How was I supposed to know he lived here?" "You've been given the chance to resolve the issue respectfully," Melanie said, her voice steady but firm. "But you chose to escalate it. And now, we have the video to prove it." Deborah's face reddened as the weight of the evidence set in. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Ewan watched her carefully, noting the look of frustration and defeat that had replaced the confident posture she had carried earlier. Finally, she muttered, "Fine. What do you want me to say?" Melanie leaned forward, her gaze unyielding. "This behavior is harassment. Deborah, as of today, you're receiving a formal warning. If there are any further incidents, your lease will be terminated. For a moment, there was silence. Deborah stared at the table, her hands now tightly gripping her purse. Then, with a huff, she stood up abruptly, gathering her things. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath as she stormed out of the room. Evan stayed seated for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. He hadn't wanted to escalate things, but now he realized how important it was to hold people accountable for their actions. As he walked out of the leasing office, the weight on his shoulders seemed a little lighter. It wasn't over yet, but today had been a small victory. Later that evening, as the sun set over Phoenix, Evan found himself sitting in his apartment, staring at his phone. The video had continued to spread, and the media had picked it up. News outlets were discussing the broader implications of the incident, and social media platforms were flooded with discussions about racial profiling and the need for accountability in communities. Evan had been invited to share his story on a popular talk show, and activists had reached out to him, offering platforms to amplify his voice. In the midst of all the attention, Evan remained humble. He never set out to become a symbol, but he understood the responsibility that came with it. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about sparking a conversation that could lead to real change. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that his actions had made a difference. And that was enough for now. The following weeks brought unexpected changes to the Palms. The incident had sparked a community-wide dialogue, and Melanie, the property manager, began organizing workshops on unconscious bias and community building. The complex, once fractured by unspoken tensions, began to transform. People started to look at each other differently, not as strangers or potential threats, but as neighbors who shared a space and a common goal of living in harmony. Evan, for his part, embraced the change. He found himself speaking with neighbors he had never interacted with before, exchanging pleasantries and even sharing meals. Eleanor, the elderly woman who had stood up for him, became a regular visitor to his apartment, often bringing him baked goods and stories from her long life. The final piece of healing came when Evan organized a community barbecue. It was an open event, inviting all residents to come together and connect. The event was a resounding success. People of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life gathered in the courtyard, sharing food, laughter, and stories. It was the kind of event that Evan had hoped for when he first moved to the Palms, a place where people truly belonged. As the night drew to a close, Eleanor approached Evan with a plate of cookies. "You've done something really special here," she said warmly, her eyes glistening with pride. Evan smiled and accepted the plate. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You were the first to speak up." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Well, somebody had to. But you turned it into something meaningful." As the last of the guests left and the courtyard slowly emptied, Evan stood alone for a moment, reflecting on how far he had come. The events that had started as a painful confrontation had grown into something greater, a movement for change, a call for unity, and a reminder that small acts of courage could ripple out and transform communities. He knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The Palms was no longer just a place to live, it was becoming a community. And that, he realized, was the true victory.